Good evening, everyone. I've got some slides for you, and I always start with the first slide. And this is a date on the 17th of August 2013 when 5 million people may well have woken up and bought a copy of the Daily Mail. And some of those people may have opened it up and seen this double-page spread and read a story about how an ex-army officer could squander £750,000 over 3 years, losing his home, his wife and children, and his job, and pretty much everything. I was one of those people that bought that newspaper, and I looked at it, and I thought, now would be quite a good time to talk to my eldest son. He was 12 years old. We went for a walk. He knew something was wrong. And I gave him the newspaper. He read it from top to bottom. And after he'd finished reading it, he looked at me, and he said, "Dad, you mucked up. Don't do it again." And that day was a day when, I came to my senses and realized that, life needed to move forward. I want to take you back to the start of that story. I want to share with you how that could possibly happen. Because at the time when I found online gambling, I had pretty much everything. And so I want to talk to you about how life was good, and then how I found that gambling, maybe why I found that gambling, and then I want to share with you the recovery. So I'm going to take you on this journey, and I'm going to take you back to quite a difficult place. And if it's not difficult for you, I can tell you it's going to be difficult for me. And then I'm going to share with you the hope I found. And I want to talk about Alpha too, because it is such a wonderful, wonderful course. And it's a course that we run at my church. So I guess it all started as I was growing up. I came from a Christian family. Some of you may have heard of my mum. It's wonderful tonight to meet someone who even knew my grandfather. I guess in terms of Christianity, my family has quite a heritage. But I needed to come to my own decision about where I stood with my faith. And I actually made a deliberate decision to not go to the same church as my parents as a teenager. And I guess you could share, and I'm going to use this word because it's a word I'm going to come back to. You could say that I was living my life in the light. What I mean by that is that I was probably quite an authentic teenager. I was a Christian. I would wake up in the morning and I'd read my Bible, and I wouldn't consider doing stuff that wasn't in the light. And I wanted to be genuine about that. I wanted to be honest, and I was quite happy to share my faith with people whenever I could. I actually wanted to be a pilot. That was my ambition. And the army were going to be mad enough to try and teach me to fly. But first I had to get through the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, through officer training. And I turned up on the morning of my first day at Sandhurst. And as I got out of the car, my mum gave me a little book. It was called Living Light. See, I'm coming back to that word light again. Living Light. And it's just some verses that you read in the morning, some verses that you might read in the evening on a theme. And in the front of this little book, she'd written something. It said, as an army officer, you'll be responsible for the lives of your men. But as a Christian, you'll be responsible for their souls as well. And she went on to say, you might not have time to read your Bible when you're on exercise or when you're on operations, but we hope you'll have time to keep reading this. And I did. And I had a chance quite early on in my time at Sandhurst to make a bit of a stand for my faith. What they tell you to do at Sandhurst is to be a grey man. Don't do anything badly. Whatever you do, don't do anything well. Just blend into the background. But unfortunately, I found that quite difficult to do. There was a commotion after a couple of days at Sandhurst, and I went to see what all the fuss was about. And there was a notice board in the corridor. A big crowd had gathered around this notice board. And it said, rugby trials this Saturday. If selected, you get Wednesdays off training. So all 420 people in my intake turned up for the rugby trial. Because there were so many of us, they invited a few of us to come back the next day for a final trial before selection for the game that was going to happen the following week. When I woke up the next morning, I knew what I had to do. And I plucked up my courage, and I went to see the officer commanding rugby. Yes, that was his title. And he was a lieutenant colonel, taller than me. He had big bushy sideburns. You know what? He even had a monocle. And I stood to attention. I'd been taught the day before. And I said, "Sir, I can't play rugby today. I'm a Christian and I want to go to chapel." He didn't bite my head off. I wasn't selected for the starting 15 in the game the following Wednesday, but I was a reserve. And the person that was in my position got injured within a few minutes. I went on, I played the best game of rugby I've ever played. And within 2 weeks of standing in front of that colonel, he came to see me and asked me if I would consider being the captain of the Academy First 15 rugby team. And that was a real honour because the commandant, the general at Sandhurst, loved his rugby. And he used to come and speak to me and say, "Oh, who are you playing today?" or "Who's been selected?" And I think I must have been the only officer cadet he actually knew by name, because at the end of my time at Sandhurst, when he had to decide who would graduate top of that intake, he chose me. And I was awarded the Queen's Sword of Honour by the Queen's representative. Princess Alexandra was there. My mum was there to watch me being presented with the sword. And I have to tell you, it's one of the proudest days of my life. But my career didn't all go to plan in the army. You know, I said I wanted to fly. Well, I could fly. That was okay. The flying bit was fine. I had a slight problem, though. I couldn't actually land. And so after a very near mid-air collision, I had to go and see the commanding officer. He said, "Justyn, before you kill yourself or someone else, you need to find another regiment to go to." So I was dealing with some anger issues. I'd always wanted to fly from a very young age. Someone whispered in my ear that the Royal Artillery shot aeroplanes down. So I joined them instead and felt much better. I went pretty much from that failed flying training to an operational tour in the early 90s in a place called Besbrook in South Armagh, the border country, the bandit country as it was called, a beautiful part of the world, but very dangerous to be if you're a soldier in the early 90s. But I loved my time in the army. I was a thrill seeker. And the army, I say I was a thrill seeker, I probably still am, but the army gave me an opportunity to really excel in things, to volunteer for things and be promoted and then never have to stand still. And I was always thinking about the next thing. I was restless. I went from one thing to the next. I volunteered for parachute training and I had a forward observation role where I would be parachuted in, and then I did the All-Arms Commando course and recognised as one of the toughest military selection courses in the world. And I served for 3 years in 3 Commando Brigade. I went to Bosnia in the late 90s, and it was there, having been promoted to a major, and for 2 months was probably the youngest major in the British Army at the time, still in my 20s. I saw some things that I probably didn't deal with very well. I saw some quite recent results of ethnic cleansing. There was a village that looked like any other village in Northern Europe, and yet every house had been reduced to a pile of rubble. And right at the top of the hill in this village was a school. And in the school was a playground, and on the playground were all the shapes and hoops and goalposts that any other playground would be painted with. And yet on the wall there were bullet holes where they'd lined all the children up and shot them one after the other, and take the women away to one place and the men to another. My driver that day was the second row in our regimental rugby team. Big chap, the kind of chap you want on your side when the going gets tough. And I looked at him, he had tears in his eyes. When I got back from Bosnia, I went on leave. And I had a conversation with some friends. They'd left the army a couple of years before. They were working in London, they were making great money. And I got thinking about stuff. When I got back to my regiment, they told me that I wouldn't be able to be promoted until for another 6 years. And as a restless person, always thinking about my next step, I resigned my commission. And I thought, I'm going to go and work in the city. I'm going to follow the path of my friends. I'm going to earn plenty of money. Now, all the time, I was still living my life in the light. I was still reading my Bible, still reading that little book that my mum had given me, and still committing my life to God most mornings. But I went from being a major who had been in charge of about 460 people on this high-pressure operational tour to being a junior T-boy, and I mean a junior T-boy. They didn't trust me even to answer the telephone for about 3 weeks. But I was ambitious. I wanted to catch up. And so when everyone else left at 5 o'clock in the evening, sometimes I would get my books out and stay there till 9 o'clock at night. And the only people left in the office at 9 o'clock at night would be the cleaners and the managing director. And sometimes he'd sit down next to me and ask me what I was doing, why I was still at work when everyone else had gone home. And I looked at him and I'd say, "Boss, I want to catch up." Within 2 years, I'd moved on, and I was one of the youngest managing directors of a financial services company, working in the City of London. I had a 6-figure salary. I had a nice car, a nice house. I'd married the girl of my dreams. We had a lovely son, another one on the way. Life on the outside looked pretty good. Can we just bring up the next picture? I apologise for this, and I'm also going to apologise for the next slide, but there are reasons why I'm going to show you them. There are 2 reasons for showing you this picture. One is I have a horrible, smug smile on my face, and the other is, if you look really closely, just behind my head, by an accident of photography, you can see across the Bay of Naples, that was taken on the Isle of Capri, a volcano. That's Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that erupted in AD 79, destroying Pompeii. See, inside my head, I had a volcano, and that volcano was going to erupt catastrophically over the next 3 years, destroying everything that I'd come to know. You see, the reason was I'd pushed God away. I'd had a conversation with him. I didn't stop believing in him. I just had the conversation. It went a bit like this. "Thank you, Lord. You've given me so much. I'll take it from here." And that's when things began to go wrong. Let me just show you a couple of slides. I just want you to see what life was like before I had my first bet. Sorry about that one. We had nice holidays. That's Emma. Do you know I would never have considered lying to her? She was my best friend, my soulmate. I would never have had a secret from her. Matthew had been born. Oscar was on his way. Little Matthew, when he was 11 months old, I noticed something was wrong. At least I thought something was wrong. He didn't use his right hand for anything. I said to Emma, "Don't you think it's odd? Matthew doesn't use his right hand." She said, "Oh, we've got left-handed people in the family. He'll just be left-handed." This was my state of mind. I lived in Derbyshire, and I worked in the City of London. I commuted every day, there and back, on the train, drive to the station, underground to my office, probably about 3.5 hours of travel, 5 days a week. I left when it was dark, before anyone was awake, and I got home when they were all asleep. But I said to myself, that's what you have to do in life if you want to get on. But you know what? That commute was ripping out my soul. I'd been passed over for a promotion. If I'm really honest with you, I was bored with my work. I was well paid, but I just moved from quite an exciting sales position into quite a senior managerial position. And everyone did their own jobs around me. I stopped playing rugby competitively a few years before, and I was missing it. One morning, I was on my way to the station, and I turned the radio on. I heard an interview by the retired footballer Philip Neville, who's now manager of the England ladies football team. He was talking about how he noticed his daughter, when she was 11 months old, didn't use her right hand for anything. They'd taken her to see a consultant. She had a diagnosis for something called right-side hemiplegia. It's a form of cerebral palsy. She'd had a stroke, probably as she was being born, and now she had limited movement down her right side and no dexterity in her right hand. I couldn't stop thinking about that. When I got back home that night, I said to Emma, "Can we please take Matthew to see someone, just to rule things out?" So we went to see a consultant, and within just a few minutes, the consultant said, "I can see your son has stiffness down his right side. He's got no dexterity in his right hand. Those are classic symptoms of a right side hemiplegia. He needs to have a scan." So he had a scan, and on the day that we saw the results of this scan, I walked into the consultant's office and I looked at this 3D picture of my son's brain on a computer screen. And I could see a great big scar. We said, "What does this mean?" She said, "Matthew had a bleed into his brain. That's the scarring that you can see. It probably happened during labour, although we can't be sure. He has a right side hemiplegia with no dexterity in his right hand. He never will. He will always have stiffness down his right side. And as we got up to leave, she said, oh, and by the way, he may well go on and have fits or seizures or develop epilepsy at some point in his life. 1 week later, I was at home. It was a hot day. Matthew had a temperature and a streaming cold. He was in my arms, and his right arm started to jerk. I knew what was happening. I just did everything wrong. I tried to talk him out of his fit. I put my arms around him to try and comfort him and reassure him. It was a crazy thing to do. It was a febrile fit caused by a very sharp peak in his temperature. I should have loosened off his clothing, let him cool down, and then come round, but he didn't come round. I put him in the car to take him to the hospital. That was wrong too. There was loads of traffic. And I looked over. Matthew had turned blue, and his lips were a dark shade of purple. We drove back to the house, laid Matthew out on the back seat. I put my cheek up against his face. I'd been taught in the army, if you want to see if someone's breathing, you put your cheek up against their face and you feel for the breath. I couldn't feel any breath. And I did something that I hadn't done for a long time. I prayed. I said, God, please help. I don't want to lose my son. And pretty much straight away, round the corner came my next door neighbour. I'd been giving my son mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, tipping his head back, blocking his nose, clearing his airway, and trying to breathe for him. And my neighbour was a retired surgeon. He stepped in, took over. The ambulance came. They gave him a drug that pulled him out of his fit. And he was okay, but I wasn't. I handled it really badly. You see, I had these dreams that my son would be able to land an aeroplane, that he'd be able to play rugby better than I would. All those selfish things you have for your son as a father. Emma went online. She Googled hemiplegia. She got her head around it. Somehow she managed to understand, but I think I kind of went into denial. It was a week after that happened. I was at home and I was watching a game of rugby, something I'd done 1,000 times before. I would never, ever have considered having a bet. I've always been quite careful with money. I looked after other people's money. I looked after our money in the household. I have my own account. But for the first time, I noticed one of those adverts. If you watch TV now, even though there's meant to be a 9 o'clock watershed, 18% of every advert that you see is gambling related. And adverts around sport are absolutely fine. Adverts around bingo are absolutely fine for some reason. I saw one of these adverts. It was for a £5 free bet. I got my laptop without even thinking about it. I deposited the £5 I needed for my free bet and I won. And suddenly I thought, wow, I know a little bit about sport and this is actually quite exciting. Why am I going down to London and back every day when I could stay here and do this? And do you know what? I didn't tell Emma when she came back. I didn't tell her that I'd won my first bet. I've asked myself so many times, how would my life have turned out if I'd have lost that bet? I now had a secret from my wife for the first time. I began to gamble a little bit more often. I began to take more of an interest in sport. At first, I stuck to the sports I thought I knew something about. And one morning, I phoned up my boss and said to her, I'm not being productive to you, travelling down to London and back every day. Why don't you set me up from home and I'll come into the office once a week? So he did. I did my work in 2 hours. And then the rest of the day would stretch out ahead of me. I'm not a great person when I'm faced with boredom. I like to fill my time. I began to take more of an interest in different sports. I began to gamble more frequently. Not big bets, but more frequently. One day I realised, after about 6 weeks, 2 months, I wasn't actually very good at gambling. I was losing more often than I was winning. And so I said to myself, I'm going to stop. But the problem with me, I'm very competitive. I'm a very bad loser. I'm also an optimist. I always expect the best outcome. Those are not good traits for a gambler. You see, I said to myself, I'll stop gambling, but first I'll win my money back. A tennis match was coming up. I calculated that if I put £1,000 down on the outcome of that match and I won, I'd win all my money back in one go. I said I could close my account down and walk away from this and be a better husband again, be a better employee, be a better father. But I lost that bet, and the very first thing I did is pick up the phone. I called my bank manager, I arranged an overdraft, and I put another £1,000 down on the next tennis match. I'd stepped over a line. As I stepped over that line from someone who just has an occasional bet to someone who was chasing their losses, my hands were shaking. My heart was beating quickly. I was petrified that if Emma walked through the door to see me doing something as crazy as that, she'd be livid. Now there was a hole in my finances. Now it began to be slightly harder for me to afford our lifestyle that we'd lived. But you see, I didn't want her to know. I didn't want anyone to know that I had a bit of a habit, that I'd been stupid with my money. So I carried on living in the way that we'd lived, but I carried on betting to try and win that money back, to fill in the hole, which meant that my finances got into a worse and worse situation. To win that money back, my bets got more risky. They got bigger. They got more frequent. I began to spend more and more time in front of my computer screen. I began to stop engaging with Emma and talking to her and just enjoying a sunset. I would always be thinking about the next bet. And rather than looking after Matthew, and by now Oscar had been born as well, rather than looking after them both and doing the story time and the bath time and volunteering for nappies, which, by the way, I had no problem with, I'd make an excuse. I'd say, I'm sorry, Emma, I can't do that this evening. You see, I've got to prepare, the American markets are coming online, or there's a presentation that I've got to get ready for tomorrow. Anything but tell her the truth, which was that I was closing myself away and finding more and more obscure things to gamble on. I didn't know very much about third division Romanian football, but still I think to myself, I had a chance to win some money back. My mood swings were all over the place. When I was winning, I was up here. When I was losing, I was down in the dumps. I've always been pretty level-headed. I'd always been a happy person on the outside. So Emma could see that I changed. Bless her. She thought it was her. She thought it was my work. She thought it was the fact that we lived in a town. And when we had an opportunity to move out to the countryside, when someone knocked on our door and said, we pass your house every day, it's beautiful, can we buy it? We sold it. I took the money from the sale of that house and put it in my account. We moved into a rented property out in the countryside where we looked for someone to live. Emma made it her ambition, her mission to find the perfect house. And one day I was sitting upstairs after about 6 weeks of moving from our home. In the office, the spare room I used as an office, I looked out the window. I could see Emma coming up the lane. She had a spring in her step. She was happy about something. When she got to the window, she called up and said, Justyn, I found it. I found the perfect house. Come on, come with me. I went with her to the end of the lane. There was a beautiful old Victorian brick wall, a kitchen garden, a house that had been knocked down between the walls, and it had a lovely cottage and views for miles. And the lady that lived there, she hadn't even put the house on the market. She'd fallen into conversation with Emma and wanted to move quickly. She'd lost her husband, sadly, and wanted to move in with her daughter. The price was really reasonable. I desperately looked for a way out. There was a pond in the corner of the garden, actually no more than a puddle, but I pointed to it and I said, look, Emma, we can't live here. Matthew might fall in and drown. That beautiful smile on her face just dropped. You see, she thought her children would be safe here. She thought it would be the next chapter in our life. She thought she'd get me back. She talked about times when I wasn't present, and I wasn't. It had nothing to do with the puddle, though. I'd begun to squander the money from that house. I'd begun to gamble with it. And by now, to cover up my tracks, I'd begun to borrow as well. I had so many loans already by then, and I'd eaten away into our deposit. I was pretty sure we wouldn't get a mortgage. It was my pride that was stopping me from getting any form of recovery. My pride that stopped me from putting up my hand and saying, listen, I'm really sorry. I've got myself into a habit. I've caused a bit of damage to our finances, but worse, I've been lying to you. I didn't do any of that. See, I desperately didn't want anyone to know. I'd always been successful on the outside. I didn't want my family to know the truth that I had mucked things up, the truth that I'd been dishonest, deceitful, reckless. Matthew had a diagnosis for autism as time went by, and his little brother Oscar was born. The day that Matthew walked was one of the best days of my life, and I still remember it really clearly. About a year after he could walk, he said to me, "Daddy, please, will you take me to the swings?" As an autistic child, his mind is set on one thing. Very difficult for him to change his mind. We were down at my in-laws' house. It was raining outside. We'd finished lunch, and Matthew looked at me again and said, "Daddy, please, will you take me to the swings?" Emma said, "Oh, go on, take him. But could you drive home first and pick up his coat?" So I put Matthew in the car, in the front seat, strapped him in, drove back a couple of miles to our house. I left him in the car as I walked inside to put my hand on his coat. And then I'd remembered that morning I placed a bet. I thought I'll just go and check my account and make sure the money's coming in, and then I can have a nice time with my son. But I lost that bet. I remember feeling angry, and I did something really stupid. I thought I'll just go to the online casino. I'll spin that roulette wheel once. I'll win the money back that should have been in my account. Then I can go and have a nice time with Matthew and not have to think about gambling. But it was 2.5 hours later, and I'd emptied out my bank account again. I went downstairs, and Matthew had fallen asleep. And the tears that he'd cried were dried on his cheeks. What kind of a dad was I? One who by now had realized I had a problem. But still I didn't put my hand up. Fast forward now, and it all happened within the space of 3 years, from start to finish. But maybe go two and a bit years on from when I had that first £5 free bet. Emma was in the house, and she opened up the fridge, and we had no food. She said, "Justyn, we need to go shopping and get some food for the children." I had no money in my account. I was a shareholder. I was a director. I had a 6-figure salary, and yet I couldn't afford to buy food for my family because I had wasted my wage already. And I juggled around with my finances, with payday loans, with credit cards. There was no way I could borrow any more money. I was completely maxed out. I was juggling my debt, and that debt was stressful. And actually, when you lie about something, that's quite stressful too, because you have to remember what you lied about in the first place. And all the stress of that and the shame that I was feeling was something that pushed me back to pressing a button. I know there's no way you'll understand the logic of that. It was crazy. It was more of an escape, though. I thought every time I placed that bet I couldn't afford to lose, maybe this would be the time. Maybe this would be when I win the money back and cover everything up. I was waiting for the conversation that Emma was having with me to say, "Can I have a look at our bank statement?" I'd sit there in bed while she was sleeping. I'd listen to her breathing, and I'd think, what question could she ask me tomorrow? My whole life had become a sham. We went to the supermarket. We bought the groceries. And as we stood in the checkout queue, I was desperately thinking of things I could say. Could I lie? Could I say I'd forgotten my wallet? Could I get her to pay for the groceries? When it was our turn, I got my wallet out. I took out my corporate card, a card I could only use for work expenses. As I paid for the groceries with my corporate card, I thought, it's okay, I'm not stealing here. If my work asks me, I'll just say I got my cards mixed up, and then at the end of this month, I can just pay that money back and everything will be okay. But 2 days after that, I realized that my gambling account worked on my corporate card account. And as I pressed the button to do that gambling transaction, I knew my career was over. That was it. All those years of working so hard, of climbing up the corporate ladder, in one single press of a button, I was throwing it all away. It took 2.5 months for my company to ring up, and when they did, the conversation went something like this. "Justyn, something terrible's happened. Your corporate card, it's been cloned. There's fraudulent activity, gambling transactions. I'm really sorry, we're going to have to cancel your card and get a new one. Is that okay?" I said, "Boss, They're not fraudulent, they're my own. I went in to see the head of HR. She'd lined up all my corporate card statements and asked me to underline the ones that were my own. £27,500 worth of my company's money. At that point, there was no way my company could keep me on. And actually, they would have been well within their rights to call the police. In fact, they didn't. They didn't even have a disciplinary hearing. They just asked me to leave. I don't think they knew what to do with me. I had quite a prominent role within the insurance market, and I think they were scared of the reputational damage it might do. I went home. I should have sat down and talked to Emma. Instead, I lied. I said, I've got another job to go to. I'm going to be on gardening leave for about 6 weeks. I've got a couple of interviews that I need to go to, but other than that, I'm going to be at home. Sometimes I'd put my suit on, and I'd get in the car, and I'd drive a couple of miles up the road, and I'd sit there with my smartphone, gambling for 6 hours. And then I'd come home, and I'd make up some fictitious routine about what I'd done that day. She must have known something serious was up. I think she was scared to ask me. I felt so much shame, but not enough to stop me from doing what I was doing. Often I'll ask, I'm asked by people, they'll see a TED talk that I've done, or they'll read a book, or they'll hear me speak, and they'll come up and they'll say, Justyn, look, you found recovery. You found a way through. I will do anything. What is it? What's the secret? I'm going to do anything except for one thing. I just can't tell my wife, or I can't tell my husband. I'll always say to them, please, tell your wife. Don't let her find out. Tell her you're doing something about it. Tell her that there's been a problem. Tell her the truth. Don't hide it, but give them some hope. I didn't tell Emma. She found out. We had friends to stay. They found a bank statement, showed it to her. I can still remember the expression on her face as she showed it to me and said, tell me this is a mistake. I told her everything, and bless her, she stood by me to start with. We went online, and I self-excluded myself from the gambling site I'd used. But you know what? There's 2,500 online gambling sites, regulated gambling sites in the UK that I could visit. I would have to have gone to all of them and excluded myself from each one. And by word, they don't make it easy for you to exclude. I even called the helpline, and I got a couple of free sessions of counselling. And at first, things looked okay until I had an email. An email from a gambling company offering me a £50 free bet. I said to myself, that's okay. That's not really gambling. It's a free bet. That'll be okay. I was right back into my old ways. This time Emma could see. One morning I woke up and the house was quiet. There was no sound of the children having their breakfast or watching TV. Emma had gone. She'd taken the children with her, and she was right to go. Because I was self-destructing and I was pulling everything in around me. I'd wake up in the morning and I'd think, how can I make some, how can I stop, first of all? For the first 2 minutes of waking up, how can I stop? I don't want to do this anymore. And then after 2 minutes, I'd think to myself, you know what? You've thrown your life away. You had so much, it's all gone now. There's no chance Emma will come back. You won't get your job back. So what have you got to live for? You might as well have a bet. There's always a chance you could win your money back. So I'd search through the house for things to sell. We had some beautiful things. I had a Breitling watch Emma had given me as a wedding anniversary present. I'd sold it for a fraction of what it was worth. At the time, she asked me, why wasn't I wearing it? I lied and said I'd been swimming it, got some water in, and I had to send it off to a manufacturer. I always had some excuse. But now, without Emma there to see me, I systematically went through the house and began to sell everything that was valuable. One morning, I did the most stupid thing of all. I sold the most precious thing that I owned. It wasn't particularly valuable. There was a bit of metal about this long. It took me 3 attempts to go in and sell my sword of honour. But on the 3rd time I did. I got £200 in cash for it. When I walked out the door, I was crying my eyes out. That little bit of metal had represented everything that had been good and right. It represented a time when I'd been putting my Creator first in my life, and I was honouring Him in what I was doing. And that sort of honour was going to be something that I was going to pass on to my children. The next morning, with the money gone, I came to my senses. I phoned up the shop. I said, I made a terrible mistake. I sold you something yesterday. I need to get it back. He said, we've sold the sword. It's gone, and there's no record of who we sold it on to. Those times were dark times. Tomorrow is World Mental Health Day, and I could tell you that my life was pretty dark. If we use the light and darkness analogy, those 6 weeks were so dark. It was November. I couldn't afford to heat the house. I was living off a sack of mouldy potatoes. I just remember everything being dark. I remember thinking what life might be like for my children if I wasn't around permanently. There was a knock at the door. My mum came up from Kent. She said, Justyn, your father-in-law told us about everything that's been happening. He's paid off the rent arrears, 5 months rent arrears. Tomorrow the house is going to be repossessed. He wants you out. You can walk the streets, or you can come back and try and find some recovery. Over the next hour, I was completely and totally humiliated. On the day that my mum had been there to watch me being presented with the Queen's Sword of Honour at the Sovereign's Parade at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, she was also there to see me walking around the house with a black bin liner. I'm putting my last possessions together, some pictures, some clothes. I had £73,000 worth of debt, no job, no car. My family had gone, and now I didn't even have a roof over my head. I was a broken man. But I needed to be broken. When I went back home to Kent, to the spare room I'd left when I was 18 years old, going off to seek my fortune, I got down on my knees. I prayed a very simple prayer. And if any of you come on Alpha, it's probably a prayer that you're going to hear or something very similar to it. I said I was sorry. I asked God to come back into my life again. And I asked Him to fix me. That day was a day in November 2012. It's almost 7 years ago. I haven't had a bet since. Every single day that went past, my life got better. My mum showed me love. She didn't judge me. We had some rules. I put a bit of software on my computer that meant if I tried to access a gambling site, it would send her an email. That worked quite well. I was away from all my triggers, those things that reminded me of gambling. I had a new chance to start afresh. People often ask me, what did you replace your addiction with? It's a great question. And if I'm on live TV or live radio, I love answering it. Because I replaced my addiction to gambling, a horrible, selfish, destructive thing that damages loads of people around you, with my relationship with Christ. I began to wake up in the morning, got the Bible that was in that bottom drawer out. I got my little book, Living Light, and I'd read it. And as I read it, amongst all the chaos of my life, I felt peace. I didn't particularly like myself. In fact, I loathed myself. But I began to feel forgiven. I began to see myself as my Creator sees me. Someone who loves me despite my faults. Someone who won't love me anymore by doing good things, and certainly won't take that love away when I do silly things. I felt loved. And in the security of that love, light began to come back into my world. I began to see things that I'd not seen before. Sunrises. I began to hear the birds singing again. I began to find the joy in small things in life. I wanted to do something that would get rid of this self-loathing. So I began to swim. I swam when I was younger, and this might tell you a little bit about my character. I couldn't just do a couple of lengths up and down. I volunteered to swim across the English Channel, which is recognised as one of the most arduous endurance swims in the world. And a year after I'd stopped gambling, I swam solo across to France. I want to tell you about that journey, and I'll finish with it. But I want to just share with you how life began to get better when I was living my life back in the light of Christ, when I was listening to him through his word, when I was talking to him about all the worries I had. Oh, I had so many worries. The big thing I was worrying about was the debt that I had. And actually, when you think about suicides, if I tell you these figures, that if you are a compulsive gambler, and by the way, there are 340,000 of them in the UK, 55,000 of which are between 11 and 16. If I tell you that if you are a compulsive gambler, you are 15 more times more likely to commit suicide than anyone else. 1 in every 10 suicides that happens in this country is gambling related. I lost my joy, but that joy came back. And that joy came back by the simple things. I began to spend more time with my children, with my boys. I was present. This time Emma could see. Can we just pull up some pictures? Spending time with my boys was what was important. And I was present again. Emma could see that. And, you know, I wish I could tell you that this story ended really happily and you know, there's a wonderful finish. And for about 9 months, when I told this story, it was a happy ending because Emma came back. She left Derbyshire. She went all the way down to Kent. We got a house together. We formed a home again. But do you know what? When I told you that I hadn't told her that she found out, do you know what that cost me? It cost me her trust. Because even after 9 months of being honest, and trying my best not to do stuff. If I was 5 minutes late for something when I'd said I'd be there, she panicked. She worried. She thought I was doing what I was always doing all over again. She had been coming to terms with the fact that she lived with someone for 3 years not knowing who that person was. And bless her, she could not trust me. We got divorced 3 years ago. And she's now with someone else. But I have a place up in Derbyshire, a couple of miles away from my boys, and I'll go and see them most weekends, and I'll spend time with them, and that's such an important thing. Every day that went by, something new got restored. And for many years, we were good, close friends, even after we were divorced, and we did everything with our children. Matty's quite difficult, as you can imagine, as an autistic, hemiplegic, epileptic child, with a younger son there, Oscar, who's also quite needy. It's tricky doing stuff on your own, and Emma has been brilliant in the things that she's done with me. My Sword of Honour came back. 3 years after I'd lost it, someone saw it online. It has my name on it. They Googled it. It was an ex-army officer looking for something to buy. He thought, a Sword of Honour? No one sells that. There must be a story here. It's got to be stolen. They Googled my name. If you Google Justyn Larcombe, you can find lots of stuff online. They contacted one of the newspapers. And by the way, I went to the newspapers because I wanted to tell the truth about gambling. Because gambling is portrayed in this country as just a bit of fun. If I go into a school and I'll speak to year 11, 16-year-olds and I'll ask them straight, who's got a gambling app on their smartphone? And by the way, I'll do that before I tell my story. And you'll be so surprised. Often more than half of them will put their hands up. This is something that is hidden and coming in under the radar. It's something that people are learning through gaming. You might have seen in the news this week about a new clinic that the NHS have just opened in London for young people, 11 to 16-year-olds, who are getting addicted to games. But it's not the fact that they're getting addicted to games that's worrying. It's the fact that within those games, there are certain things where you learn risk and reward. Small microtransactions that allow you to risk something, whether it's real money or your mum's debit card, or whether it's just coins within that game. You can go in and learn the rules of gambling. Matthew, when he was 7 years old, was playing his favourite game, Roller Coaster Tycoon. But he wasn't just, this is a game where you build funfair rides and people come and visit. He wasn't building a funfair ride, he was playing a fruit machine. And one of the things he's built himself on this game is a casino. I did some research into Roller Coaster Tycoon. It's owned by a gambling company based in Las Vegas. And unfortunately, young people are being conditioned to tell them risk and reward is okay. And if you have a bit of a risk, normally you'll win something back. It might not be quite what you wanted, These are loot boxes and all kinds of things where you can go in and get a better weapon or a better character. And they'll encourage you to go back and try and get a better one next time. And when you go into a casino, you learn the rules. So when you're 18, it's actually quite normal to have a gambling account. Whereas when I was younger, it wouldn't have been. Only 0.9% of the population make up that 340,000 problem gamblers. But most people are now gambling. If you're an adult in this country, 75% of you will have had a bet within the last year, 40% within the last 4 weeks. Unfortunately, it's smartphones and it's advertising which are creating this growing problem. I began to put my head above the parapet, and as I did newspaper articles or wrote that first book, people began to get into contact. They began to ask me into their school to talk to the children, or maybe go in to the army and talk to some of the soldiers where they had a problem. Go into professional sports clubs, go into prisons, all of these places, financial services sector. I'm going up to Glasgow on Tuesday next week to speak to an insurance conference where we're looking at how the insurance industry can respond to modern addictions like pornography and like gambling. I also started a charity which looks after a course called the Recovery Course. It's a Christian course. I went along to Gamblers Anonymous, which was wonderful for me because I discovered I wasn't the only idiot in this world. There were people out there who had made even worse mistakes than I had. But I was struggling with the fact that I couldn't talk about my faith. I wasn't allowed to. And when I wanted to talk about how God had fixed me, how I'd walked 1,000,000 miles away from Him, but only needed to take one step back, and He was right there, I couldn't do that. I had to talk about a higher power or a God of my own understanding. So we started this charity, and it runs a course that comes from Holy Trinity Brompton. It's on exactly the same format as Alpha. In my church, Tunbridge Baptist Church, we run the recovery course, and on the very next week, in the same room, they run an Alpha course. Because the recovery course isn't just for Christians. It's very much a Christian course. It's as the original 12 steps were designed when they were written back in the 1930s by two Christian pastors. And rather than talking about a higher power or God of your own understanding, we talk about God. And people come into our church who aren't Christians, and after 15 sessions, they find wonderful release. And not just release from the outer symptoms, but the inner pain. You see, I don't believe I ever wanted to be an addict. I think I had some bits and pieces of pain inside me, much of it self-created. But gambling was an escape. What the recovery course does, in a really honest way, it says, let's address the stuff inside us. Let's look at our resentments that we're carrying. Let's think about that pain that we have for loneliness or maybe a broken relationship. More people in society today live alone than they ever have done before. Gambling's made out to be sociable. Addiction is made out to be sociable. And yet, if you're an addict, you'll know you push the people away that you love the most. So the recovery course is just an honest way of restoring relationships and inviting Christ back into your lives. 27 people went from the recovery course onto our first Alpha course, and many of them became Christians and now take an active part in their church communities. They've replaced their addiction to drugs and alcohol and pornography and shopping and food with a wonderful, more fulfilling relationship with their Creator. We run a conference every year. We've got the next one coming up in November. Can we move that next slide along, do you know? Life now is about being honest. It's about being truthful. I was a liar for 3 years of my life. And when everyone discovered the truth about me, when they realized actually I wasn't Justyn Larcombe, the successful ex-army officer or businessman, I was just flawed, it became easier for me to be myself, and I didn't have to pretend anymore. And I now look at myself, or try to look at myself, in the way that my Creator looks at me. I don't know where you are with your faith, whether you have a faith, whether you've had a faith in the past, or whether you are living your life like I guess I was when I was growing up in the light. But wherever you are, being sorted on the inside is so much more than the image that we portray on the outside, than the mask that we wear. Let me share this story as I finish with my channel swim. I wanted to raise some money for my son's charity, Hemi Help. And so I did the swim for sponsorship. And before I set off, and we set off from somewhere just around the corner from Dover Harbour, between Dover and Folkestone, I had the chance to speak to my pilot. My pilot was an experienced boatman, and he would be for 27 years getting people backwards and forwards over the channel through the two busiest shipping lanes in the world, through some of the most difficult tile conditions off the coast of France. I looked at him and said, "Please, can you just give me one bit of advice?" He said, "Justyn, all you've got to do is stay close to the coast. Stay close to the boat. Don't stray away. Just follow me and I'll get you there." And so I did. For 10 hours, I followed the boat really closely, and that is the track, the GPS track you can see. Sticking out there quite near to the boat is Cap Grenay, as part of the French coast that he was desperately trying to get me round the back of. I didn't choose to go in that direction, by the way. I wasn't seasick. That's tidal influence. The tides in the channel are really quite strong. I was moved up the channel, and the idea was that I would be moved back down the channel, and he'd get me round the back of Cap Grenay. I didn't know any of that. But 10 hours in, when that GPS track was taken, something catastrophic happened. I saw France. And I suddenly thought to myself, I've done it. I know where I'm going now. I hadn't been able to see the coast all day. It was in a complete haze. I kept looking, trying to build my hopes up, and then I saw it. And when I saw it, I suddenly thought, well, that's great. I'll just head for the closest part of the coast. And as I headed for the closest part of the coast, my pilot and the boat drifted further and further away from me. I couldn't understand why they were going in that direction, when I could see the French coast just in front of me. It got dark. And a lovely flat sea that it had been all day changed quite suddenly when the wind picked up. I had a 15-knot wind in the opposite direction to the tide, and that meant waves. As I was being battered and bruised by these waves, I'd turn my head in the darkness and I'd get a mouthful of salt water. My throat was closing up. My tongue was expanding. I was struggling to breathe, and my shoulders ached. I was freezing cold. And all the time on the boat, they were calling me back. Come back. Come back to the boat. Eventually, they got a big light and they shone it in this patch of water where I'd been swimming all day. And I suddenly realized they really do want me to go back over there. I don't know why they're going in the wrong direction, but I'll follow them. When I got back to that patch of light, I got shelter from the wind in the lee of the boat. I could see the waves. They were still there, but I could see them now. As I turned my head, I got oxygen, because if I saw a wave coming towards me, I'd duck. I got encouragement from them. They gave me a triple strength carb feed, and they got me to the coast of France. That's like my life. When I go off on my own in the darkness, doing my own thing, thinking I know best, things go catastrophically wrong. But when I live my life in the light, putting God first, not necessarily knowing the direction He's leading, but following Him, things go well. From now on, I intend to live my life in the light. And if you haven't done that yet, sign up for Alpha, because light is so much better than darkness.